The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin walls with a force that made the old wooden structure groan. Snow piled against the windows, turning the world outside into a swirling, endless white. Inside, Elias Kane sat hunched near the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The storm had been raging for days. He was no stranger to the brutality of winter. Nearly 15 years in the wilderness had hardened him, shaped him into a man who could endure hunger, cold, and isolation better than most. He had chosen this life, a life away from the noise of men, away from expectations and disappointments. He pulled the thick wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, staring into the fire. His supplies were running low, but he'd manage. He always had. Then the sound came, a deep, resounding crack. Elias stiffened, his instincts sharpening. He had lived in the wild long enough to recognize every groan of the trees, every creak of ice shifting beneath snow. This sound was different. Something was outside. He reached for his rifle, every muscle in his body tensed. The wind howled again, but beneath it, he could hear the distinct, guttural panting of an animal. And then, crash! The cabin door buckled inward, the flimsy wooden latch snapping like a twig. The cold rushed in first, stealing the warmth from the room in an instant. Then, a massive shadow filled the doorway. Elias barely had time to react before the beast stumbled inside. A bear. It was bigger than anything he had seen up close before, its thick fur matted with ice, ribs jutting out beneath its coat. The creature swayed on unsteady legs, its breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. Its dark eyes locked onto Elias, hollow with hunger. Elias raised his rifle, the weight of it steady in his hands. One shot. That's all it would take. And yet, the bear didn't charge. It didn't growl. It barely acknowledged the weapon pointed at its head. Instead, it took another weak step forward, then collapsed. The cabin shook as the beast's massive body hit the wooden floor, sending up a cloud of dust. Its breath rasped in the heavy silence, chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. Elias remained frozen, finger hovering over the trigger. The fire crackled beside him, casting a warm glow over the dying animal at his feet. He could kill it now, put it out of its misery. But something in its eyes made him hesitate, a deep, weary resignation. It hadn't come here as a predator. It had come here to die. Elias kept the rifle trained on the bear, his breath slow and measured. The cabin walls seemed to close in, the only sounds the fire's crackling and the ragged, wheezing breaths of the massive creature sprawled across his floor. The logical thing, the safe thing, was to kill it. A bear this weak, this desperate, was unpredictable. If it decided to lash out, Elias wouldn't stand a chance. Even in its pitiful state, it was still a force of nature. But it hadn't attacked. That alone made him hesitate. Keeping one eye on the beast, Elias took a slow step to the side, shifting toward the table where his hunting knife rested. If the rifle failed, the blade would be his last defense. The bear barely reacted. It lay motionless, ribs expanding and contracting beneath its thick, ice-clumped fur. Damn it. Elias exhaled sharply, lowering the rifle. His gut told him the bear wasn't a threat, at least not tonight. If it had enough strength to attack, it would have done so already. Instead, it had come here looking for shelter. Or maybe it hadn't expected to find him at all. Either way, it wasn't leaving. Elias cursed under his breath and moved toward the fire. If this bear was going to die, it wasn't going to be on his floor, rotting and stinking up his cabin. He grabbed a sturdy wooden rod from the corner and cautiously prodded the beast's flank. "Come on," he muttered. "Move!" The bear let out a low, grumbling noise, barely lifting its head. Elias nudged it again, harder this time. "Get up!" Nothing. It was completely spent. Elias clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath his ribs. He had half a mind to drag it back outside, let nature take its course. But the wind howled through the broken door, snow piling in thick drifts against the threshold. If he threw the bear back into the storm now, it wouldn't last the night. This is a mistake. He knew it, felt it in his bones. But even after years in the wilderness, after training himself to be ruthless, something inside him balked at the thought of letting the creature die here. Stupid. Dangerous. But Elias was no stranger to hunger. He had felt that same gnawing, bone-deep emptiness before. On bitter nights when his traps came up empty, when winter's cruelty seemed endless. The bear wasn't an enemy. It was just a survivor, just like him. Cursing under his breath, Elias moved to the shelf where he kept his supplies. He grabbed a chunk of dried venison, tearing off a strip before cautiously stepping closer. The bear's nose twitched. Weak as it was, it still had enough sense to recognize food. Its head lifted slightly, dark eyes locking onto Elias's hand. He tossed the meat onto the floor between them. The bear didn't hesitate. It dragged itself forward, snapping up the offering in a few desperate, jerking movements. Elias watched, expression unreadable. He could almost see the moment the bear realized it wasn't getting more. It sniffed the air, lifting its heavy head just an inch higher, then let it drop back onto the wooden floor with a sigh. Elias stared at it for a long moment before rubbing a hand over his face. He'd fix the damn door in the morning. For now, he grabbed a thick wool blanket, draped it over his shoulders, and settled down by the fire. The bear huffed quietly in its sleep. Elias shook his head. What the hell am I doing? The storm raged on through the night, rattling the cabin's walls and whistling through the cracks where the door had been forced open. Elias barely slept. The bear lay motionless near the fire, its heavy breathing filling the silence between gusts of wind. Elias kept his rifle within reach, every survival instinct in his body screaming at him that this was a mistake. But morning came, and the bear was still there, alive but weak. Elias sat up, rolling his stiff shoulders. His cabin was freezing, the fire having died down to glowing embers. He needed to rebuild it, needed to fix the damn door before the cold turned his shelter into a tomb. And then there was the bear. It shifted slightly, one massive paw twitching as it stirred from sleep. Elias tensed, fingers curling around the rifle. The bear groaned, blinking sluggishly. It was too weak to be a threat, at least for now. Elias exhaled sharply and stood. He had things to do. The first priority was the door. Elias stepped outside, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. The storm had buried everything under a fresh layer of thick snow. His breath curled in the air as he trudged toward his small woodpile. He worked fast, cutting and nailing planks to reinforce the broken entrance. The wind stung his exposed skin, but he forced himself to focus. Inside, the bear stirred but didn't try to move. Elias eyed it warily as he stacked more wood near the fire, feeding the flames until warmth seeped back into the cabin. The bear watched him now, not in an aggressive way, just watching. Elias scowled. "Don't get any ideas, you're not staying." The bear blinked, then closed its eyes again. Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He was talking to a damn bear now. Maybe isolation really had made him lose his mind. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten. He moved to his supplies, what little he had left. Dried meat, a few potatoes, some oats, enough to last if he was careful. He tore off another strip of venison, then hesitated. The bear hadn't moved much since last night, its body still curled in exhaustion. It was starving. Elias sighed. "This is stupid," he muttered. But he tossed another piece of meat toward the beast anyway. The bear's nose twitched. It opened its eyes, sniffed the air, and dragged itself forward just enough to snatch the food up. Elias watched as it chewed, slower this time. It wasn't just eating, it was surviving. A part of him knew he should stop, should force the thing out before it grew stronger, before it became dependent. But another part of him, the part that knew the brutal hunger of winter firsthand, couldn't bring himself to do it. The bear finished its meal and settled back down with a quiet huff. Elias stared at it for a long moment before shaking his head and turning back to the fire. This was temporary. It had to be, right? Days passed in an uneasy truce. Elias tended to his daily tasks, hunting when the storm allowed, chopping wood, keeping the fire alive. And the bear, it lingered. It wasn't strong enough to leave, and Elias wasn't cruel enough to force it out. The first few nights he slept with his rifle close, waking at the slightest movement. But the bear never made a move toward him. It barely moved at all, conserving what little energy it had. Each morning, Elias found himself tossing another strip of dried meat toward the beast, watching as it slowly ate. He told himself he was being practical. If the bear was too weak, it might die right there in his cabin, and he wasn't about to deal with that mess. But the truth was, he saw too much of himself in the creature. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about endurance, and this bear had endured. Elias was outside, resetting his traps when the first sign of trouble appeared. Tracks, fresh ones in the snow, winding between the trees. Not bear tracks, human. His pulse quickened. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the indentation. The snow hadn't fully settled in, which meant they weren't more than a few hours old. Someone was out here, and they were close. Elias stood, scanning the tree line. His cabin was deep in the wilderness, far from any town or established trail. The only people who came this way were hunters, trappers, or men who didn't want to be found. He wasn't in the mood for company. Gripping his rifle, he followed the tracks, moving swiftly but cautiously. The trees were thick, their skeletal branches casting long shadows against the snow. Then he saw them. Two men huddled near a half-buried sled. One was younger, barely more than a kid, struggling to clear the snow. The other was older, with a thick beard and sharp eyes that darted around, scanning the surroundings. Elias didn't recognize them. That made him uneasy. Hunters and trappers usually stuck to their own territories, and strangers meant trouble more often than not. He stepped forward, letting his presence be known before they could mistake him for something lurking in the woods. Lost! Both men jolted, the younger one nearly falling backward. The older man was quicker to recover, turning toward Elias with a measured look. Not lost, he said. Just stuck. Elias studied the sled. It was loaded with supplies, pelts, dried goods, tools, enough to suggest they'd been out here for a while. Storm caught us, the younger one muttered, brushing snow off his coat. We were trying to make it back south, but our sled runner cracked. Been walking since yesterday. That explained the tracks. Elias didn't lower his rifle. You from town? Near enough. The older man eyed him. Didn't think anyone else was out this far. Elias didn't answer. He preferred it that way. There was a long silence. The wind whistled through the trees, rattling the branches. Finally, the older man sighed. Look, we're not looking for trouble. Just need a place to warm up before we freeze to death. Elias exhaled slowly. He didn't like this. But leaving them out here in the cold meant they'd die. And as much as he wanted to be left alone, he wasn't the kind of man to let that happen. Not yet, anyway. Come on, he said gruffly. I've got a fire. When they reached the cabin, Elias stopped them just outside. Stay here. The men exchanged glances but didn't argue. Elias stepped inside first, rifle in hand. The bear was still near the fire, watching him with half-lidded eyes. It was stronger than before, sitting up more now, though it still hadn't fully regained its energy. It looked at Elias, then toward the door where the strangers waited. Elias sighed. Yeah, I know. The bear didn't move as he stepped back outside. The older man raised an eyebrow. Problem? Elias glanced at them, then at the surrounding woods. If they had weapons, they hadn't drawn them yet. But he wasn't about to let his guard down. Just don't touch anything, he said, stepping aside to let them in. The warmth of the fire was immediate, and the younger man groaned in relief, rubbing his hands together. Then he froze. What the hell? His wide eyes locked onto the bear. The older man stiffened, hand twitching toward his belt. Elias stepped between them and the beast. Relax, he said. It's not going to kill you. The younger man let out a nervous laugh. That's a damn bear. Yeah, Elias said dryly. I noticed. The older man studied him carefully. You keeping it as a pet? Elias scowled. It broke in during the storm, starving. I haven't shot it yet. Yet? The younger man swallowed hard. That thing's still dangerous. I know what's dangerous. Elias gave him a flat look. Another silence. The fire crackled. The older man sighed, settling onto a chair. Well, ain't the strangest thing I've seen out here. Elias watched them carefully. He didn't trust them. Not yet. But for now, they were all stuck in the same place. The storm outside was unforgiving. And inside, the cabin had just gotten a whole lot smaller. The cabin was too small for this many bodies. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, while the two strangers made themselves as comfortable as they could. The younger one, Matthew, kept shooting uneasy glances at the bear, while the older man, Callum, watched Elias like he was trying to figure him out. The bear, for its part, remained curled up near the fire, its breathing steady but alert. It wasn't fully recovered yet, but it was no longer helpless either. Elias could feel the tension thickening in the room. "I appreciate the fire," Callum said finally. His voice was calm, measured. "Wasn't expecting company out here." Elias glanced at him but said nothing. The younger man scoffed. "You weren't expecting this either," he muttered, nodding toward the bear. "Who the hell keeps a bear inside?" "I told you," Elias said, his voice flat. "It was starving." Matthew shook his head. "Should have killed it." The scrape of Elias's knife against the sharpening stone was the only sound for a long moment. Callum shot his companion a look. "That's enough." Matthew frowned but didn't argue. Elias's grip on his knife tightened. He didn't care what these men thought about the bear. What did bother him was their presence. Strangers in the wilderness always had a reason for being here, and Elias had a feeling these two weren't just lost hunters. "You said your sled broke," Elias said finally, breaking the silence. Callum nodded. "That's right. Where were you headed?" Callum hesitated. Matthew answered first. "South." "South," Elias repeated, unimpressed. "That's vague," Callum sighed. "We're traders. Take furs, supplies, make our way between settlements." Elias glanced at their worn coats, the rough hands, the practical boots. They could be traders, but something didn't sit right. Still, he let it go. For now. He had other concerns, like the way Matthew's gaze kept shifting toward the bear. Elias had seen that look before. Predatory. Callum must have noticed it too because he changed the subject. "We won't stay long, just until the storm lets up." Elias nodded but said nothing. He didn't trust them, and he didn't like the way Matthew was eyeing the bear like it was nothing more than a payday waiting to happen. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, keeping one eye on the bear and one on the strangers. Matthew shifted in his sleep, muttering. Callum snored softly, arms crossed. The bear was awake. Elias could see the way its dark eyes flickered in the firelight. It wasn't afraid, but it was watching. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. Something told him trouble was coming, and when it did, he needed to be ready. The storm lingered, howling through the trees, trapping the three men and the bear together in an uneasy truce. Elias spent the next day keeping his hands busy, chopping wood, checking his traps, anything to put distance between himself and the two strangers. Callum mostly stayed inside, nursing a bad knee he claimed was acting up from the cold, while Matthew took every opportunity to prowl around, eyes always drifting toward the bear. Elias didn't like it. Late in the afternoon, he returned from resetting a snare and caught Matthew near the fire, tossing small bits of dried meat toward the bear. The bear, stronger now, didn't flinch. It watched him with wary eyes but took the food all the same. Elias shut the door hard enough to rattle the cabin walls. Matthew turned, smirking. "Just being friendly." Elias didn't smile. He shrugged off his coat and set his rifle aside, but his movements were slow, deliberate. "That's so," Matthew's grin widened. "Yeah. Figured if you're not going to kill it, might as well make it useful." Elias felt his patience thinning. "It's not useful to me." Matthew scoffed. "Come on, look at the size of it. Once it's strong enough, you could use it to haul game. Hell, sell it to a traveling show. That thing's worth more alive than dead." Elias's jaw tightened. "It's not for sale." Matthew leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Everything's for sale." Elias didn't bother answering, but inside something dark stirred in his gut. Matthew wasn't just talking, he was planning, and that meant Elias had a decision to make. That night, the storm began to die down. Elias stood outside, breathing in the crisp air. The snow had settled into heavy drifts, but the worst of the wind had passed. It wouldn't be long before Callum and Matthew could leave, and that meant Elias needed to make sure they did. He re-entered the cabin quietly. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. The bear lay curled near the heat, breathing slow and deep. Matthew was already asleep, snoring lightly. But Callum was awake. He met Elias's gaze across the room, something sharp and knowing in his eyes. He's got bad ideas, Callum murmured. Elias didn't reply. Callum sighed. Look, I'll get him out of here tomorrow. Just keep your rifle close. Elias studied him. He didn't trust Callum, but he believed him about one thing. Matthew wasn't going to leave the bear alone. The question was, how far would he go? Elias didn't intend to find out. He grunted and settled into his chair, keeping his rifle within reach. If Matthew tried anything, there wouldn't be a second warning. Elias didn't sleep. He kept his rifle close, watching the fire burn low as the storm finally loosened its grip. The cabin was still, save for the rhythmic breathing of the bear and the occasional rustle as Callum shifted in his sleep. But something felt wrong. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the wind. It was the silence. Then he heard it, the creak of boots on wooden planks. Elias kept his breathing steady, his fingers tightening around his rifle. He didn't move, didn't open his eyes. He listened. Another step. Slow, careful, near the bear. Matthew. Elias's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay still. He could hear the faint rustling of fabric, the shifting of weight. Then a metallic sound, a knife being unsheathed. Elias's eyes snapped open. In the dim firelight, he saw Matthew crouched low, one hand reaching toward the bear, the other gripping a knife. His fingers hovered over the thick fur, his expression gleaming with a mixture of greed and excitement. Elias moved. Fast. Before Matthew could react, Elias had his rifle pressed to the back of the man's head. The younger man froze. "Drop it," Elias ordered, his voice cold. Matthew hesitated just for a second, but Elias didn't give second chances. He cocked the rifle. Click. Matthew's knife hit the floor. The bear stirred, its deep eyes flicking open. It let out a low warning rumble, shifting its weight. Elias grabbed Matthew by the back of his coat and hauled him away from the bear, shoving him toward the door. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Matthew stumbled, then whirled around, hands raised. "I wasn't going to hurt it." Elias's glare could have split stone. "Bullshit." Matthew's eyes darted to Callum, who was now awake, sitting up in his cot with a heavy sigh. "You dumb bastard," Callum muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. Matthew scowled. "It's a damn bear. You saw it. It's strong now. That pelt alone." Elias slammed the rifle butt into Matthew's chest, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, gasping. "I don't give a damn about its pelt." Elias's voice was low, dangerous. "I told you before, it's not for sale." Matthew straightened, his expression dark. "Then you're a fool." Elias's finger twitched on the trigger. Callum stood, raising his hands. "All right, that's enough." He leveled a look at Matthew. "We're leaving. Now." Matthew's nostrils flared, but he didn't argue. Elias didn't lower his rifle. "Take your things and get the hell out." Matthew scoffed but did as he was told. He snatched up his pack, shoving supplies inside with jerky, angry movements. Callum sighed, grabbing his own gear. He paused at the door, glancing at Elias. "Appreciate the shelter." Elias said nothing. Callum gave a short nod. Then he grabbed Matthew by the arm and dragged him outside. The wind had settled into a low howl. The storm was over, leaving behind a thick blanket of untouched snow. Elias watched them go, rifle still in hand. Only when they disappeared into the trees did he finally shut the door. He turned to the bear. It was fully awake now, watching him with quiet understanding. Elias exhaled slowly. "Guess it's just us again." The bear rumbled softly, settling back down. Elias sat near the fire, keeping the rifle within reach. Something told him Matthew wasn't done causing trouble, and the next time, Elias wouldn't just warn him. The next morning, the world outside was eerily quiet. Fresh snow covered the trees, untouched except for the single trail leading away from the cabin, the path Callum and Matthew had taken. Elias didn't trust it. He had spent too many years in the wild to believe that a man like Matthew would give up so easily. The bear, now strong enough to stand and move without strain, padded toward the door, sniffing at the cold air that slipped through the cracks. Its wounds had healed well, though scars remained. Elias had seen the same scars on men who had survived too many battles. He gathered his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder. "Stay put." The bear exhaled, watching him but making no move to follow. Outside, the crisp air burned in his lungs. The sky was clear, the kind of pale blue that only came after a brutal storm. Elias followed the path leading away from his cabin, boots crunching in the snow. He needed to be sure. After 20 minutes of walking, he found their old campsite, the remnants of a fire, discarded bones from a meal. But the real problem lay a few feet beyond. Tracks, leading back toward the cabin. Elias's pulse quickened. They hadn't left. They were circling back. He crouched, studying the prints. One set was lighter, Callum. The other, heavier, had a more erratic stride. Matthew. They had been watching. Elias straightened, every nerve in his body alert. He turned back toward the cabin, moving faster now, his instincts screaming at him. Matthew hadn't just wanted to kill the bear, he wanted to take it, and Elias wasn't about to let that happen. Back at the cabin, the bear was restless. It paced near the door, nostrils flaring. Snow swirled against the windows, casting faint shadows across the wooden floor. Then it heard something, a soft crunch outside. Its ears twitched. Another sound, slow, deliberate footsteps. The bear lowered its head, muscles tensing. A shadow passed the window. Then, the latch on the door shifted. The bear growled. The door burst open. Matthew stood in the doorway, a rifle in one hand, a length of rope in the other. His grin was wild, eyes alight with greed. "Well, look at that," he murmured. "Still here." The bear's growl deepened, a low, rolling thunder in its chest. Matthew took a step inside. "Easy now." He lifted the rifle, but before he could take aim, something slammed into him from behind. Elias. He tackled Matthew, knocking the rifle aside. It went off, the gunshot shattering the stillness. Wood splintered. The bear roared. Matthew struggled, but Elias was stronger. He drove a fist into the younger man's ribs, sending him sprawling. Matthew scrambled for his rifle. Elias was faster. He kicked it away, then grabbed Matthew by the collar and shoved him hard against the wall. Matthew gasped, eyes darting toward the bear. "You!" Elias pressed his forearm against the man's throat. "You think I'd let you take it?" Elias's voice was quiet, deadly. "You don't listen, do you?" Matthew choked, clawing at Elias's grip. "It's just an animal." Elias's patience snapped. He threw Matthew to the ground. The younger man coughed, glaring up at him. "You're out of your mind." Elias stepped back, picking up Matthew's rifle. He turned it over in his hands, then, without a word, snapped the bolt and threw it aside. Matthew's face twisted in fury, but he didn't get up. "You leave now," Elias said, voice calm but firm. "And you don't come back." Matthew hesitated. Then he spat at the ground. But he knew. He couldn't win. With a final glare, he staggered to his feet and stormed out into the snow. Elias didn't watch him go. Instead, he turned to the bear. It was still tense, breathing hard, watching him with those deep, knowing eyes. Elias exhaled slowly. He reached out. The bear didn't flinch. For the first time, it leaned into his touch. Elias nodded to himself. "You're not just an animal." The bear huffed softly as if in agreement. Outside, Matthew's footsteps faded into the distance. Elias knew this wasn't over. Not yet, but he'd be damned if he let anyone take the bear away from him now. The cabin was silent after Matthew left, but Elias knew better than to relax. Men like Matthew didn't take losses lightly. Elias reloaded his rifle with steady hands, his mind working through the possibilities. Matthew was dangerous, but he was also wounded. His pride had been hit harder than his body. That made him reckless. The bear, still restless from the fight, paced near the door, its massive frame casting long shadows in the firelight. Elias watched it move, considering his options. He had two choices: stay and wait, prepare for whatever Matthew had planned next. Leave, take the bear and disappear before the fight could escalate. Both options had risks. The storm had passed, but the snow was still deep. Traveling would be slow, dangerous, and he had no idea where Matthew might be waiting. But staying meant drawing this out. And if Matthew returned with more men, Elias wasn't sure he could fight them all. His gut told him to move. Elias grabbed his pack, stuffing it with the essentials: ammo, dried meat, bandages. The bear watched him, ears twitching. "You don't belong here anymore," Elias muttered, securing his gear. "Neither do I." The bear huffed. Outside, the air was still, the trees heavy with ice. Elias opened the door, scanning the forest. No sign of Matthew. Yet. He turned back to the bear. Come on. It hesitated, glancing around the cabin, the place where it had healed, grown stronger. Then with a slow step, it followed. They moved through the forest cautiously. The snow was thick, slowing their progress. Elias led the way, rifle in hand, scanning for tracks. The bear followed close behind, its breathing deep and steady. Hours passed. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in streaks of cold fire. Then Elias saw it. Tracks, fresh, leading toward his cabin. His stomach tightened. Matthew had gone back. Elias could picture it. Matthew storming into the empty cabin, realizing he had lost the fight. And men like Matthew didn't just accept loss. They retaliated. A flicker of movement caught Elias's eye. A head, half hidden in the trees. A figure. Matthew, and he wasn't alone. Two other men stood beside him, rifles in hand. Elias's breath slowed. He had been right. Matthew wasn't done. The bear let out a deep, low growl, sensing the threat. Elias clenched his jaw. This wasn't a fight he had planned on, but it was one he wasn't going to walk away from. He shifted his grip on his rifle, leveling his aim. If Matthew wanted a war, he'd get one. The forest stood silent. Elias barely breathed as he took in the sight ahead. Matthew and two other men, rifles slung over their shoulders, scanning the woods like hunters closing in on prey. Except this time, they weren't just hunting a bear. They were hunting him too. Elias kept low, using the trees as cover. The bear beside him was tense, its muscles coiled, its breath a slow, steady rumble. It sensed the danger, just as Elias did. Matthew's voice cut through the stillness. You can come out, old man. Elias's grip tightened around his rifle. He stayed put, watching, studying. We both know how this ends, Matthew continued, his tone laced with amusement. You're protecting that beast like it's some damn pet, but we both know what it really is. Silence. Matthew exhaled loudly. Just give it up. You get to walk away, and I get what I came for. Elias smirked. Not a chance. One of Matthew's men, a broad-shouldered brute with a thick coat, turned toward him and muttered, You sure he's even out here? Matthew's face darkened. He's here. The second man, younger, fidgeted nervously. This ain't right, Matt. I came to trap, not... A gunshot shattered the quiet. The younger man yelped, dropping behind a tree. The older brute cursed, ducking low. Matthew just stood there, frozen. The shot had come from Elias. A warning. His voice followed a moment later. Calm but ice cold. You boys have one chance to walk away? Matthew's lip curled. Or what? Elias didn't answer. The bear shifted beside him, a low, guttural growl vibrating in its chest. Matthew's eyes flickered toward the sound. And that's when Elias struck. He moved fast, years of survival kicking in. Another shot, this time aimed low, at the ground near Matthew's feet. The snow exploded, making him stumble back. The brute fired blindly into the trees, but Elias had already moved. The bear surged forward. Matthew barely had time to react before a massive wall of muscle and fur was upon him. His scream cut through the air as the bear swiped, knocking the rifle from his hands. The brute turned his gun on the bear, but Elias was faster. Boom! One shot. The brute crumpled, his weapon dropping into the snow. The younger man, terrified, ran. He didn't look back. That left Matthew. He scrambled away from the bear, panting, his hands up in surrender. Elias! Elias stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Matthew's chest. The bear stood beside him, breathing heavy, watching his enemy with cold, dark eyes. You should have left when you had the chance, Elias muttered. Matthew swallowed hard. Elias cocked the rifle. Matthew bolted. Elias didn't stop him. The coward fled into the trees, slipping and stumbling through the snow. He wouldn't be coming back. Not after tonight. Not after this. Elias lowered his rifle, exhaling deeply. The bear huffed, watching Matthew disappear. Then slowly it turned back to Elias. The two stood there side by side as the first rays of morning light painted the sky in hues of gold and blue. It was over. The bear was free, and for the first time in a long, long time. So was Elias. Elias never saw Matthew again. He didn't need to. Winter slowly loosened its grip, giving way to the first hints of spring. The snow thinned, the rivers thawed, and one morning as Elias stepped outside, he saw the bear standing at the tree line, looking at him. There was no urgency, no desperation, just understanding. Elias nodded once. "Go on." The bear exhaled. Then without a sound, it turned and walked into the wild, its massive form disappearing into the trees. Elias watched until it was gone. Then for the first time in years, he smiled. And as the sun rose over the mountains, he turned and walked back inside, a man with nothing to trap and nothing left to lose.